The man next door doesn't remember me, and I need him to keep it that way. He came back after 11 years, and she looked him dead in the eyes and said she'd never seen him before in her life. The most dangerous man in the city. The only man she ever loved. Standing 3 feet from her front door with rain dripping off his jaw and a look on his face like the world owed him something. She kept her voice flat, kept her hands still, told him her name was Nora Ashcroft, pleased to meet you, and closed the door on 11 years of buried grief before her knees could give out beneath her. If you've ever had to pretend a person didn't destroy you just by existing, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. Follow this story all the way to the end. You won't see the ending coming. The estate sat at the edge of a cliff like something that had been daring the sea to take it for 100 years. 3 stories of pale stone and iron-framed windows, the kind of architecture that announced money without needing to explain itself. The access road was barely 2 lanes of cracked asphalt carved into the hillside, bordered on one side by a rusted guardrail and on the other by nothing. Just open air and a drop of 200 feet to where the Atlantic chewed on the rocks below. Nora had chosen it for exactly that reason. The isolation, the inconvenience, the fact that getting here required effort most people wouldn't bother with. She'd been renting the smaller house at the end of the shared gravel drive for 14 months. The big estate next door had stood empty for most of that time. She'd grown used to the darkness in its windows, the way the wind moved through the property without resistance, the total absence of another human being within shouting distance. She'd built her routines around the silence: morning coffee on the east-facing terrace before the fog burned off, the walk down to the tidal pools at low water, dinner at 7, lights out at 10, no exceptions. She had not built her routines around the possibility of Lucian Vale. She heard the convoy first, 3 black SUVs and a panel van with blacked-out rear windows, grinding up the access road sometime after 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in late October. She was on the terrace with a half-finished cup of coffee and a stack of quarterly reports she was supposed to have read 3 days ago. The sound of engines on that road was unusual enough that she set the reports down. When the lead vehicle appeared at the crest of the hill and turned into the neighboring drive, she felt a low, unreasonable tension in her chest. Not fear. Something older than fear. She told herself it was nothing. New tenants, some corporate rental arrangement. People came and went from estates like that one. Hedge fund types, occasionally minor celebrities, once a mid-level diplomat who'd lasted 9 days before deciding the cliffside humidity was destroying his sinuses. She picked up the quarterly report and pretended to read it. The convoy stopped. Doors opened. She could hear voices. Low, clipped, professional, and the sound of equipment being unloaded. She didn't look. She focused on a paragraph about third-quarter earnings projections that she read 4 times and retained nothing of, because some part of her brain had already clocked the shape of the man who stepped out of the second vehicle and was refusing to process it. She looked anyway. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe that was the black coat. Wool, long, the kind of thing that moved with him rather than on him. He had his back to her, speaking to someone beside the van, one hand gesturing in a slow arc that she knew meant he was giving instructions he expected followed, without repetition. His hair was shorter than it had been at 26. His shoulders carried more weight. Everything about his posture said he had spent 11 years learning to occupy space in a way that didn't invite challenge. She recognized the back of his head before she recognized anything else about him, and that recognition hit her somewhere between her sternum and her throat and stayed there, a hard knot of something she did not have a name for anymore. Lucian Vale. Nora set down her coffee. She gathered the quarterly reports. She went inside, locked the terrace door, and stood in her kitchen with her back against the counter and her eyes closed for a long time. She did not make dinner that night. She did not turn the lights on at 7. She sat in the dark in her living room and thought about the 14 months she had spent building this particular silence, and what it was going to cost her to protect it now. The answer came the following morning in the form of a knock at her front door. She had been up since 5. She'd run the coastal path in the dark, showered, dressed in the kind of clothes that communicated she was a professional who had places to be. A charcoal blazer, dark trousers, low heels, even though she worked from home 3 days a week because heels were armor, and she had known this knock was coming. She'd made coffee. She'd positioned herself at the kitchen table with her laptop open to a spreadsheet that made her look occupied and important. When the knock came, she counted to 4 before she answered it. He filled the door frame the way he always had. That hadn't changed. Some things about a person settle into their bones so early that nothing, not years, not distance, not whatever brutal education the last decade had provided, can shake it loose. The way Lucien Vale took up space was one of those things. He was 37 now. The angles of his face had hardened past the point where they could be called handsome in any uncomplicated way. There was a scar along his left jaw she didn't remember, a thin white line that vanished into the shadow below his ear. His eyes were the same dark gray they'd always been, the color of deep water in weather. Those eyes moved over her face with the specific attentiveness of someone cross-referencing what they're seeing against a catalog in their memory. She held his gaze and felt nothing, performed nothing, just waited. "Morning," he said. His voice had dropped half a register from what she remembered. "I'm Lucien Vale. I've just moved in next door." "Nora Ashcroft," she said. "Welcome to the cliff." A pause. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not recognition, not yet, but the beginning of a question. "Have we met?" he said. "I don't think so." She said it the way she'd been rehearsing it since 5 in the morning, the same way she delivered unfavorable news to clients, even, direct, without apology. "I'd remember." He looked at her for another moment. She had the distinct nauseating sensation that he was going to push, that whatever instinct had carried him up the criminal hierarchy of an entire coast was going to identify the seam in what she was presenting and pull at it until the whole thing came apart. Instead, he nodded. "I won't be here long, 3-4 weeks at most." "Peaceful up here," she said. "Most of the time." Something crossed his face that might have been amusement if it had gone all the way. It didn't. "Right. Well?" He put his hands in his coat pockets. "Good morning, Ms. Ashcroft." "Mr. Vale?" She closed the door. She stood with one hand flat against the wood and listened to his footsteps on the gravel until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went to the bathroom and turned on the cold tap and held her wrists under the water for a long time, breathing through her nose, watching the drain. 3-4 weeks, he'd said. She'd been telling herself for 11 years that if she ever saw him again, the distance she'd built would hold, that the version of herself who had loved Lucien Vale was someone she had carefully and deliberately dismantled, piece by piece, in the years that followed that last night, until there was nothing left of her but scar tissue and forward motion. She'd been wrong about that. She'd changed her running route that afternoon. The coastal path ran too close to the shared property line at the northern end. She switched to the inland road, 2 miles longer, worse terrain. She called her office manager and scheduled 3 consecutive days of in-person meetings in the city, work she could have done remotely but wouldn't now. She rearranged her grocery delivery to a different pickup window, small adjustments, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching. She didn't think about how visible they might be to a man whose entire professional survival depended on noticing when people changed their behavior around him. She found out on Thursday. She was loading her car, overnight bag, laptop case, the dry cleaning she kept forgetting to drop off. When he appeared at the far end of the drive, he wasn't walking toward her, he was on a call, pacing the edge of the property where the gravel gave way to scrub grass, his voice too low to carry. He had 2 men positioned near the gate, not bodyguards exactly. They held themselves differently than that, less visible, more patient. But the function was the same. He glanced over once. She kept loading. She felt his attention like a hand on the back of her neck. By the time she'd started the car, he'd ended the call. He was watching her openly now, hands at his sides, with that stillness he had always possessed, the quality of a person who had learned to conserve energy because there were environments where wasting it could get you killed. She reversed out of the drive without looking at him again. The city was 3 hours south. She drove the whole way with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the heating too high because she was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October temperature. She stayed 2 nights in her company's guest apartment on the 14th floor of a building with 24-hour security and a lobby that required a key card to enter. She slept badly. She told herself the insomnia was work stress. When she came back Saturday afternoon, there was a package at her door. Plain brown paper, no shipping label. Her name written on it in handwriting she had not seen in 11 years, but recognized the way you recognize your own voice on a recording. with surprise and then with the uncomfortable certainty that you've always known it was yours. Inside the package was a book, a novel, well-worn, the spine soft from multiple readings, a paperback she had left behind in an apartment in the city 11 years ago. She had looked for it in the weeks after and assumed it had been lost in the move. She hadn't been able to find another copy because it was out of print, a small press thing with a limited run, the kind of book that existed only in the margins of the larger literary world. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She put the book in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels. Then she pulled it back out, because putting it in a drawer meant she was treating it like something she needed to keep, and she didn't need to keep it, she needed to return it. She carried it next door and knocked. One of the quiet men answered. She held the book out. "Tell Mr. Vale this isn't mine," she said. The man looked at the book, looked at her. "He said you might say that." "Then tell him I've said it." She left the book in the man's hands and walked back to her house and locked her door with more force than was strictly necessary. That evening, the book reappeared on her doorstep. This time, there was a note. One line, written on a card with no header. "We both know whose it is." She stood in her open doorway reading those 6 words until the wind off the sea made her eyes water. Then she stepped back inside, and this time she put the book on her bedside table, and she told herself she did that because she was tired and it was the most available surface, and not for any other reason. She lay awake listening to the sea and not thinking about the 6-word note and failed at both. Sunday brought fog, thick coastal fog that flattened the light and made the cliff edge invisible from 30 feet back. Nora worked at her kitchen table, responding to emails, reviewing a contract her legal team had flagged, doing the ordinary maintenance of a working life. She was good at this. The forward motion of ordinary things. It had saved her more than once. At 10:30, she heard voices outside. 2 of them, male, low, and then a third voice that she recognized before she could stop herself from recognizing it, and she looked up from her laptop without meaning to. Through the kitchen window, across the stretch of dead grass that separated the 2 properties, she could see Lucien on his terrace with 2 men she hadn't seen before. They were not the same type as the quiet men at the gate. These 2 had the weight of something official, the careful posture, the slight awareness of exits that came from professional training. Whoever they were, they'd come a long way to have this conversation, and from the angle of Lucien's body, the slight shift of his weight back onto his heels, arms crossed low at his abdomen, it wasn't going well. She watched him for 30 seconds. She looked back at her laptop. She was not going to do this. She was not going to become someone who watched him through her kitchen window and cataloged the tension in his posture and constructed narratives about what it meant. She had a contract to review. She had a life that functioned. She had spent 11 years building the exact interior architecture required to keep her functional in the absence of everything she had once wanted, and she was not going to let 6 words on a card and a worn-out paperback start dismantling it. She reviewed the contract. She did not look out the window again. But she heard the 2 men leave at noon, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant fade of an engine. And she heard the quality of the silence that replaced them, and she knew that quality. She had studied it. It was the silence of a man alone with something he couldn't put down. She knew it because she had been living inside that specific silence for 11 years. Monday, she drove down to the coastal village 6 miles south to work from the cafe with the slow internet and the good scones, which she did once a week anyway, absolutely not because it put 6 miles between her and the estate. She was there until 2 when a call came in from her office manager with a scheduling question, and she was talking through her calendar when she looked up from her laptop and found Lucien Vale standing at the cafe counter ordering coffee. The village had 1 cafe. Of course he was in it. She finished the call. She closed her laptop. She began packing up with the methodical efficiency of someone who was absolutely not fleeing, who was simply done working and ready to leave. And she had her bag on her shoulder and was 3 steps from the door when his voice came from directly behind her. "You drive 6 miles for bad Wi-Fi and mediocre scones." She stopped, turned. He was holding a paper cup of coffee, watching her with an expression that contained something, not quite amusement, not quite accusation, something in between. "The Wi-Fi isn't that bad," she said. "You had 12 tabs open. 3 of them were frozen. I like the atmosphere." The atmosphere is fluorescent lighting and a ceiling fan missing 1 blade. He wasn't wrong. She had chosen this place precisely because it was unglamorous and inconvenient, and nobody with Lucien Vale's tastes would ever voluntarily enter it. She had miscalculated. "Mr. Vale," she said, "did you follow me here?" Something moved in his jaw, a small tightening. "I needed coffee. There's a fully stocked kitchen at the estate. I needed to get out of the estate." They looked at each other across 3 feet of linoleum floor. The cafe had 4 other occupants. She, a retired couple near the window, a young woman with a stroller, a teenage boy with headphones. None of them were paying attention. None of them would have known what they were watching if they had been. "What do you want, Mr. Vale?" she asked. Quietly, without heat. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped below the register of the cafe's ambient noise, something just for her. "Why won't you tell me where we know each other from?" "We don't. You flinched when I told you my name." "I was startled. You changed your running route after I arrived." "I was bored with the other one." "You rearranged your grocery pickup." The air went out of the room. Not literally. The ceiling fan kept turning. The retired couple kept talking. But something changed in the space between them, and she knew that she had underestimated him, which was something she had promised herself 11 years ago she would never do again. "You've had people watching my house," she said. "I've had people watching my property line. You happen to be adjacent to it." He took a sip of coffee, set the cup on the nearest table without looking away from her. "You're careful, Nora. Almost careful enough. But you're careful in the specific ways a person is careful when they know exactly what they're being careful about." She held his gaze. Her hands were still at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was entirely level. "I moved to the cliff for the quiet," she said. "You arrived and disrupted it. I've made some adjustments. That's not a mystery, Mr. Vale. That's just a person with a schedule and a preference for not sharing her space." He watched her. She watched him back and thought about a night 11 years ago when she had sat in a hospital waiting room with her father's surgical consent forms on her lap and a contract in her bag that she had not yet signed, and she had thought, "I can do this. I can make the decision and live with it. I can be the person who does the hard thing and doesn't fall apart." She had been right about the first 2. The third one she was still figuring out. "Enjoy your coffee," she said. "The drive back is easier when the fog's lifted." She walked out of the cafe into the gray October morning and did not look back. He let her go. She knew he wouldn't the next time. She drove back to the cliff with one hand on the wheel and the other flat on her thigh, feeling her own pulse in her palm. She had known, when she took this rental, that the coast was a small world and that the estate next door had a name attached to it, a family with money and reach and history. She had not known, she had told herself she could not have known, that of all the possible endings to 11 years of careful distance, this was the one she'd walked into. The truth was simpler and harder than that, and she knew it. Some part of her had always known that the geography of grief had a way of circling back, that you could build all the walls you wanted, and the thing you'd buried would still find a way to surface, because grief didn't follow the routes you planned for it. She pulled into her drive, sat in the car with the engine off for a few minutes, looked at the estate next door, its pale stone gray in the fog, lights on in 2 windows. His office, probably, and whatever room he used in the evenings. She went inside, made tea she didn't drink, stood at her kitchen window in the growing dark, and thought about what he'd said in the cafe, the specific precision of his observations, and felt the first real fear she'd allowed herself since his convoy rolled up the access road. Not fear of him. She had never been afraid of Lucien Vale in that way, had never had reason to be. What she feared was something else, something she recognized but couldn't name in any word that didn't sound melodramatic, the fear of being known. She had spent 11 years becoming someone Lucien Vale had never met. She had not counted on his memory being a weapon. 3 days later, she submitted a transfer request to her company's regional office in the southern city. 2 months secondment, effective immediately, citing a major client account that needed on-site attention. Her office manager was surprised. The timing was unusual. Nora told her it was necessary and didn't elaborate. That night, she began quietly packing a second suitcase. She was folding a sweater when she heard the knock. Not at the front door, at the back, The terrace door that faced the property line, the one she hadn't used since she'd seen his convoy arrive. She went still for a moment, sweater in her hands. The knock came again. Measured, not urgent. Patient in a way that communicated absolute certainty that she was going to answer it. She set the sweater down. She walked to the terrace door. Through the glass panel she could see him. Coat, no umbrella, rain beginning to come down past the reach of the terrace light. He was looking straight at the door, not at her, as if he knew she was deciding. She opened the door. He looked at her face, then at the sweater folded on the chair behind her, at the second suitcase, half packed, visible through the interior doorway. His jaw tightened once. "You're leaving," he said. "I have a work commitment. You've been here 14 months and you've never needed to go on site before." Things change. The rain came down between them. He didn't move out of it. "Tell me your real name," he said, quietly, "or tell me we've never met. Look me in the eye and tell me, and I'll leave you alone." The terrace light threw shadows across the angles of his face. The scar on his jaw was more visible in this light, that thin white line she didn't know the story of. 11 years of stories she didn't know. She stood in the doorway with the warmth of the house at her back and the rain smell of October coming off him, and thought about all the ways a silence could be its own kind of answer. "Good night, Mr. Vale," she said. She closed the terrace door. She stood with her back to it and heard him standing there. No footsteps, no retreat, just his presence on the other side of the glass, and the rain and the sound of her own breathing in the silent house. She didn't finish packing that night. She didn't sleep either. She lay in the dark with the worn paperback on the nightstand beside her, its cover facing away from her, and listened to the sea dismantle the cliff below in its slow, unstoppable way, and understood for the first time since Tuesday that she had not been running from the past for 11 years. She had been running from the moment the past caught up to her. And it already had. It had caught up the second she opened her front door and looked into those gray eyes and said a name that wasn't real and felt the whole architecture of 11 years of careful distance shudder like a structure that had never been as solid as she'd needed it to be. Somewhere in the house next door, Lucian Vale was awake. She knew that the same way she'd always known things about him that she hadn't been told. The quality of the night said so. The quality of her own sleeplessness said so. He was awake, and he was no longer asking himself whether they'd met before. He was asking himself why she was lying. He made the call at 6 a.m. Nora heard it through the shared wall of stone and silence. Not the words, just the cadence, the particular rhythm of a man giving instructions he'd already decided on before he picked up the phone. Low, unhurried. The voice of someone who had learned that urgency was a vulnerability and calmness was its own kind of weapon. She was already dressed. She'd been dressed since 4:30, when she'd given up on sleep and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with both hands around the mug and worked through what she was going to do. The answer she kept arriving at was the same one she'd had for 11 years. Nothing. She was going to do nothing except continue not being who he thought she was. She left for the city at 7. Didn't pack the second suitcase. Taking it now would look like flight, and flight was an acknowledgement, and she was not going to acknowledge anything. She took her laptop bag, her work phone, the dry cleaning she still hadn't dropped off, and she drove down the access road without checking her mirrors. She checked her mirrors. He wasn't watching from the drive. The estate's gate was closed. She told herself she wasn't relieved. She spent the day in the city. 2 client meetings, a working lunch, a late afternoon call that ran 40 minutes over because the client on the other end had questions she'd already answered twice in writing. She did all of it well. She was good at her work in the way that people are good at things they've poured everything into because they needed somewhere to pour it. She drove back in the early dark and found a car she didn't recognize parked at the bottom of the shared drive. It was a dark sedan, rental plates, engine off. The man inside looked straight ahead when she pulled in. Didn't move. Didn't look at her. That specific quality of stillness, the practiced not looking, told her everything. She parked, went inside, locked her door, stood in her hallway and thought. He didn't wait long. His name was Garrett, and Lucian had used him 4 times in the past 8 years for work that required someone capable of discretion and precision in equal measure. Garrett was not a large man. He was medium height, medium build, The kind of face that disappeared in a crowd because it had no feature that demanded attention. He had a background in financial forensics and private intelligence that Lucian had never asked about in detail because some things you hired for rather than interrogated. They met in the estate's study at 7 that evening. Garrett stood. Lucien sat. The desk between them was mahogany and old, the previous tenant's furniture still smelling faintly of someone else's cigarettes. Nora Ashcroft, Lucien said. Age 34. Works for a mid-sized corporate consulting firm, regional management, renting the adjacent property for 14 months, moved from the southern city. Before that? He looked at Garrett. What's before that? Garrett set a slim folder on the desk. Before the southern city, it gets thin. Define thin. No digital footprint older than 6 years. No social media presence. Employment records starting with her current firm. Lease history starting with an apartment in the southern city 6 years ago. Garrett paused. She exists. She pays taxes. She has a credit history. She has a professional reputation. But if you're asking where she was before 6 years ago, the record's clean in the way records are clean when someone's worked to make them that way. Lucian looked at the folder without opening it. University records? A transcript exists. I haven't been able to verify it independently. The institution's registrar office shows her enrollment, but the ancillary records, housing, student activity, campus card access, don't populate. She had them scrubbed, or someone scrubbed them for her. That kind of retroactive cleanup takes resources most people don't have. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sea made its constant argument against the cliff below. The name, he said. Ashcroft. No family members I can locate. No obituaries, no property records, no tax filings connected to that surname in any of the regions I've searched. Garrett kept his voice entirely neutral. It's possible the name is as constructed as the rest of it. Lucien picked up the folder, opened it to the single photograph inside. Nora, taken that morning, walking to her car. She was in the charcoal blazer, bag over one shoulder, and she was not looking at the camera because the camera had been 60 meters away, and she never would have known it was there. He looked at the photograph for a long time. She hasn't used a phone to contact anyone since I arrived, he said. I'd know. She uses an office line for work calls. Personal communications, if she's making any, aren't going through a traceable channel. He closed the folder, set it back on the desk. Find the before, he said. Whatever she was before 6 years ago, that's what I need. Garrett took the folder. Timeline? Yesterday. Granted. Nora noticed the second car on Wednesday. Different plates, different vehicle, same quality of stillness in the driver. Parked 100 meters further up the road this time. Less obvious. More concerning, because less obvious meant he'd recalibrated, which meant the first car had been deliberate. He'd wanted her to see it, wanted to see how she'd react. She'd reacted by going inside and locking her door, and that reaction had told him something. She ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like settling in, and she was not settling into any of this. She had a call at 9, then a full morning of document review, and she was going to do both of those things, and she was not going to think about the second car or the folder she was certain someone had opened last night in the study next door. At 10:15, the call still going, she saw him through the kitchen window. He was on his property. Barely. Standing at the edge of the scrub grass that marked where his grounds ended and hers began, looking out at the sea. He had coffee. He was not looking at her window. He was doing the thing she recognized, the thing she had once asked him about a long time ago. And he'd said, "Sometimes I just need to look at something that doesn't want anything from me." He'd said that about the ocean. She remembered where they'd been standing when he said it, a different coast, a different cliff, earlier in both their lives. The memory arrived whole and unwelcome, the way his memories always arrive now, with the brutal specificity of things you've tried to dissolve and discovered are made of something resistant. She turned away from the window. The person on the call asked her a question. She answered it. She answered it correctly and coherently, and afterward she had no memory of what it had been. He was gone from the property line when she looked again. Thursday came in cold and clear, the fog finally lifting after a week of gray, and Nora drove into the village to drop off the dry cleaning and pick up groceries rather than waiting for delivery, because she needed movement more than she needed convenience. She was in the grocery store, examining two nearly identical varieties of olive oil with the focused attention of someone who needed to care about something small, when she heard a voice she didn't recognize say her name. Ms. Ashcroft. She turned. The woman was perhaps 40, dark-haired, wearing a coat that cost more than Nora's monthly grocery bill. She was smiling with the full architecture of someone who had practiced smiling until it looked genuine and wasn't. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "Have we met?" "Not formally." The woman extended a hand. "Celeste Voss. I'm an old friend of Lucien's." The olive oil was cold in Nora's hand. She set it in her basket. She shook the offered hand because not shaking it would be the wrong kind of signal. "Nice to meet you," Nora said. "I understand you're his neighbor up on the cliff." Celeste's smile didn't move. Small world. "Isn't it? I've known Lucien a long time." The woman tilted her head slightly, a gesture that communicated something Nora couldn't quite read. Warmth, maybe, or the approximation of it. "He can be intense when he gets focused on something. I just wanted to make sure you were finding the situation comfortable." Nora looked at her. "What situation?" "The proximity. He has a way of—" Celeste made a small gesture with one hand, graceful, almost dismissive. "Occupying space. I wouldn't want you to feel crowded." "I don't," Nora said. "Thank you for the concern." "Of course." The smile again. "He's going through a difficult period. The business. There have been some internal challenges. People trying to take advantage. It's made him—" A pause, considered. "Somewhat single-minded about certain things." Nora picked up the olive oil again, the first one, and placed it in her basket. "I'll keep that in mind." "I'm sure you're very capable of handling yourself," Celeste said. There was something in the final word, a very slight additional weight that Nora identified as a threat, and then immediately reconsidered, because it could also have been her own paranoia. She wasn't sure which possibility was more unsettling. "Good morning, Ms. Voss," she said, and moved toward the next aisle. She felt the woman's attention on her back all the way to the bread. She drove back to the cliff with her groceries and her dry cleaning and a cold, specific alertness at the base of her skull. She put the groceries away. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop and typed Celeste Voss into a search field and spent 40 minutes reading what came up, and what came up was substantial. Political fundraising connections, board memberships, a family with generational money and infrastructure development, and all buried in a 3-year-old profile piece in a financial magazine. A single line about her long-standing ties to the Vale family, characterized as a personal relationship of many years' standing. Nora closed the laptop. She went to the window. The estate next door was quiet. 2 of the quiet men at the gate, lights on in the ground floor rooms. She thought about what Celeste Voss had said. He's going through a difficult period, not a warning. An orientation, the kind of thing you said to someone to establish a frame before you needed them to see things through it. She thought about the grocery store encounter and how Celeste had known her name before introducing herself, and how the phrasing had been just imprecise enough to feel spontaneous, and was almost certainly not. She thought about how you'd have to have known Nora was in the village that morning, how you'd have to have been watching the access road or had someone watching it to follow her down. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again, and dialed her office manager. "I need the secondment to go through faster," she said. "Can you push it to next week?" It's possible, but the client liaison hasn't confirmed." "Push it," Nora said. "Please." She ended the call and stood at her window and watched the estate next door go quiet as the evening came in off the water. He knocked at 8:15, front door this time. She answered it because not answering was also an answer. He looked different than he had the other times. The coat was gone, just a dark sweater, and there was something about the absence of the coat that made him seem less like the version of himself he was presenting to the world and more like something underneath it. He had a file folder in his left hand. Not Garrett's folder, she could tell from the thickness. Something else. "I found something," he said. She waited. 6 years ago," he said. Nora Ashcroft signed a lease on an apartment in the southern city. Use two references, one from a previous employer, one personal. The employer reference is clean. The personal reference, he held the folder out. The personal reference is a woman named Elena Marsh, who died 8 years ago. The cold at the base of her skull spread downward. "You've been investigating me," she said. "You've been lying to me." "You don't know that." "The reference is a dead woman, Nora." She looked at the folder, didn't take it. "Someone made an error. References get mixed up." "Not like this." His voice was flat. Not angry, something past angry, the tone of a man who'd been angry and moved through it into something more resolved. A dead woman's identity used as a personal reference on a lease is not a clerical error, it's a construction. Someone built you a past and did it fast, maybe under pressure, and they missed a detail. She said nothing. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words were quiet and absolutely direct. "I don't know why you think you have to hide from me, or what you believe will happen if I know who you actually are. But I need you to understand something." He stopped. His jaw was tight, the scar along it white in the porch light. "I have people asking questions right now who are very good at finding answers. The story you've built, it will come apart. It's already coming apart. The only question is whether you tell me yourself before that happens." The sea noise was very loud in the silence between them. "What do you want from me?" she said, very quietly. "The truth." He said it without drama, like a man stating the location of something misplaced. "Just the truth." She looked at his face, the gray eyes, the hard angles, the 11 years of distance compressed into 3 feet of porch, and one question. She thought about the hospital, the waiting room, the contract, her father's surgeon explaining a procedure in language she'd had to translate in real time because she hadn't slept in 30 hours, and fear was making everything slower. She thought about the morning she'd signed, what she'd felt, and what she'd decided to feel instead, and how she'd spent every year since then maintaining the distance between those two things. "Good night, Mr. Vale," she said. She closed the door. She pressed her back against it and heard him exhale. Just that, one breath. The sound of a man who had expected this and was not surprised, and was running out of patience with his own lack of surprise. His footsteps moved off the porch, down the gravel drive. She heard the estate gate open and close. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor of her hallway with her knees pulled up and her hands flat on the cold tile, breathing. The folder. He'd found the folder detail, the dead woman's name, and that meant Garrett, or whoever he was using, was closer than she'd anticipated. 6 years of careful construction. She'd known it wasn't permanent. She'd told herself she'd have more warning. She got up off the floor, went to the kitchen, made tea, drank half of it standing at the counter. Her phone rang at 9:40. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. The voicemail notification came through, no message left. At 10:15 it rang again. Same number. She answered. "Ms. Ashcroft." A voice she didn't know. Male, professionally neutral. "I'm calling on behalf of a mutual interest. We've become aware that you're currently in a situation that could become complicated. We'd like to offer some assistance." She gripped the phone. "Who is this?" "That's not important right now. What's important is that Mr. Vale's investigation is going to surface information in the next 72 hours that neither of us wants surfaced." A pause. "We can help you relocate. Quietly. Everything arranged, new placement, outside the country if you prefer. All we'd need in return is a conversation, just a conversation, about the Vale Syndicate's current internal structure." The kitchen was very still. "You want me to give you information about Lucian Vale," she said, "in exchange for a clean exit?" "Yes." She thought about the call's timing. She thought about Celeste Voss in the grocery store that morning. She thought about what kind of operation required both a direct approach and a leverage approach within the same 12-hour window, and what that implied about how much they'd already mapped. "Don't call me again," she said. She ended the call, stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she opened her front door and walked across the gravel in the dark to the estate next door and knocked on the gate. One of the quiet men appeared. He looked at her face and didn't ask any questions, which meant he'd been told to expect her, or told to use his judgment about situations like this. And either way, she was past caring which it was. I need to speak to him, she said. It's past 10. I know what time it is. The man studied her for another second. Then he opened the gate. Lucien was in the study. He was on the phone when she was shown in, and he ended the call the moment he saw her face, and she was grateful for that. The immediate recognition that something had changed, the absence of any performance of casual disinterest. He stood, set his phone face down on the desk. She stood in the doorway of his study in her socks because she'd walked across the gravel without putting shoes on, and she thought, this is what I've been running from, not him. This moment, this room, the point where the distance I built finally runs out. Someone called me, she said, 10 minutes ago, unknown number. They knew your investigation was running, they knew what it was going to find, and they offered me a way out in exchange for information about your organization's current internal structure. Something happened in his face. Not surprise. Something past surprise. A cold, rapid reassessment. What did they say exactly? His voice was entirely level. 72 hours. They said your people would surface something in 72 hours. They wanted information about your internal structure. I told them not to call again. And they called you how? Unknown number. No message when I didn't answer the first time. He moved to the desk, picked up his phone, made a call. 2 words, a name, then unknown number to Ashcroft's cell in the last hour. Pull it. He ended the call. Set the phone down. He looked at her. She looked back. You came here, he said. Someone is using your investigation to try to flip me, she said. That's not a position I'm willing to be in. You could have called the police. With what? An unknown number and a vague offer. He was quiet a moment. You came here because you needed me to know. His voice had changed, quieter, more careful, which means you're not neutral. You're not just a neighbor who happens to share a property line. I came here because someone is trying to use me as leverage against you, and I'm not going to be leverage for anyone. She held his gaze. Her voice was steady in a way that was costing her something she couldn't account for. I'm not your enemy. I know that. He said it without hesitation. I've known that. The study was quiet. Old cigarette smell and sea noise, and the particular density of a room where serious things had been decided. She became aware, in the too sharp way of someone running on insufficient sleep and too much adrenaline, that she was standing in front of Lucy and Vale at 10 o'clock at night in her socks, and that the folder she'd refused on the porch was on his desk between them, and that the 60-page gap between who she had been and who she was presenting herself as was collapsing at a rate that made the ground feel less reliable than it had seemed this morning. Nora, he said. Not Ms. Ashcroft, not the careful formality of the past week, just her name, with the weight of someone who had been holding it in the back of his throat and was done doing that. She should go. She should thank him for his time, walk back across the gravel, lock her door, finish packing the second suitcase, and be gone before the 72-hour window the caller had mentioned. She knew this. She had made every correct calculation, and the correct action was clear. She didn't move. The call, she said. The person who made it. They knew the details of your investigation, the timeline, what it was close to finding. That's not external intelligence. She paused. That's someone inside your operation. She watched the implication register, watched his face go still in the specific way it went still when something slotted into place. How many people know what Garrett's been looking for? She asked. He held her gaze. Didn't answer, didn't need to. The answer was already in the stillness. Someone inside your circle is watching you watch me, she said, and they're scared of what you're going to find. The silence between them stretched. The sea argued with the cliff below. His phone buzzed once on the desk. He didn't look at it. Stay, he said. Not a command. The word fell into the room quietly, with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Tonight, in the guest room. I need to make some calls, and until I know who made that approach and why, you're not walking back to that house alone. She opened her mouth. It's not a request, he said, and then immediately quieter. Please. The please was what did it, not the authority in the first sentence. The please, unguarded, without performance. The word of a man who had run out of the particular pride that would have prevented him from saying it. She stood in the doorway of his study in her socks and thought about 72 hours and an unknown number and a dead woman's name on a 6-year-old lease, and the look on his face when she'd told him about the call and how the architecture of the last 11 years had not collapsed. It was collapsing, right now, in real time, and she could feel every load-bearing wall giving way. "One night," she said. He nodded. He picked up his phone and turned away to make the call, and she stood there and let the distance between who she was and who she had been shrink to something she could no longer measure, and understood with cold, complete clarity that she had crossed a line coming through that gate tonight. That whatever the next 72 hours brought, there was no version of it where she walked back out into the life she had assembled without Lucian Vale knowing exactly who had assembled it, and why, and at what cost. She had told herself for 11 years that she could handle the moment the distance ran out. She had been wrong about that too. She slept 4 hours in a guest room that smelled like no one had ever used it. White sheets, a window facing the sea, a lock on the door that she turned before she lay down. Not because she was afraid of him, because having a locked door between herself and the rest of the world was the only way she'd been able to sleep for 11 years. And she was not going to start making exceptions now. She was up at 5. The house was quiet in the specific way of a house where other people are also awake but moving carefully. She dressed in yesterday's clothes, which was another thing she was not going to think about, and went downstairs. Lucienne was in the kitchen, not the formal kitchen, a smaller one off the back hall, the kind of secondary kitchen that large houses had for reasons that made more sense in a different era. He had coffee going and his sleeves pushed to the elbows and his phone on the counter beside him, and he looked like a man who had not slept at all, which she suspected was accurate. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Coffee," he said. "Not a question." "Please." He poured, handed her a mug. She took it and stood on the opposite side of the narrow kitchen, and they drank in silence for a moment, which should have been uncomfortable and was, instead, something else. Something that had its own particular weight, the weight of two people who had once known how to do this and were discovering the muscle memory hadn't fully atrophied. She hated that she noticed. "Garrett called at 3, he said. "The number that reached you last night ran through a routing sequence. 4 proxies, 2 foreign exchanges, military-grade anonymization. That's not someone's personal operation." "No." He set his mug down. "That's infrastructure. Someone with access to serious communication security." "Celeste Voss," she said. He was quiet for a beat. "You know that name." "She introduced herself in the village Thursday morning. She knew my name before I gave it. She knew I was your neighbor." Nora watched his face. "She said she was an old friend." The muscles in his jaw shifted. "She's been my family's choice of—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Associate, for the last 7 years." "That's not the word you started with." He looked at her. "No." She turned her mug in both hands. "She has political connections. Infrastructure money. She came to me with a framing story, told me you were under stress going through internal challenges. She was setting up a narrative before the approach came." "You think she made the call?" "I think she arranged it. She wouldn't use her own voice." Nora set her mug on the counter. "She wants to know what I know about you, which means she's already decided I'm a threat, and she doesn't yet know why." "Are you?" His voice was even. "A threat." She met his eyes. "To her, probably." He picked up his phone, stood there for a moment reading something on the screen with an expression that didn't change in any way she could name, but communicated a shift in temperature. He set the phone back down. "Garrett found something else last night," he said. He turned to face her fully. "He found a record, a legal document, notarized, filed through a private firm 11 years ago." A pause. The kitchen was very still. An agreement signed by a woman named Nora Callahan, binding contract, witnessed and sealed. The terms included a payment of $400,000 to cover medical expenses for a named third party, and in exchange, he stopped. His voice had gone completely flat. In exchange, Nora Callahan agreed to permanently cease all contact with any member of the Vale family and to make no claim on any Vale asset, personal or financial, for the duration of her natural life. The sea noise came in from somewhere distant and filled the kitchen. She could feel her own heartbeat. She had not felt it this clearly since the night she'd signed. "The named third party," he said. His voice was doing something difficult to control. She could hear the control in it, the active effort. "Was a man named Daniel Callahan, undergoing cardiac surgery at a private hospital in the city." Another pause. "Your father," she said nothing. "Nora." Not a question, not her last name, just the word, and the weight he was putting into it was something she couldn't look at directly. "The contract was executed by my grandmother's legal firm, her signature on behalf of the Vale family." "I know whose signature it was." The silence landed hard. He moved around the counter, not toward her. He stopped with his hands braced on the kitchen island, head down, not looking at her. And she understood that the posture was not about aggression. It was about containment, about a man trying to hold something inside himself that didn't want to be held. "She paid you to leave," he said. "She paid for my father's surgery." The correction came out of her before she could stop it. "The money went to the hospital. I didn't see any of it." "And you signed." He would have died. He lifted his head. She had never seen his face look quite like that. She had seen him angry. She had known his anger in all its forms, the cold kind and the hot kind and the kind that went quiet and dangerous. But this was different. This was the face of a man looking at a betrayal so old it had calcified and trying to understand which direction to point the anger and finding that every direction led somewhere he couldn't afford to go. "You could have told me," he said. "She made it very clear what would happen to the surgery funding if I involved you." She heard her own voice, how even it was, and hated the evenness because it sounded like indifference, and she had never been indifferent, not for a single moment of 11 years. She had the power to pull the funding before the procedure. She had done it before, to other people, in other situations. She documented everything, made sure I understood that any contact with you, any attempt to tell you what was happening, would be treated as a breach. And a breach meant the money disappeared. And the money disappearing meant... "He died," Lucian said. "Yes." A long silence. "Is he alive?" His voice was very quiet. "Your father." "He's been in assisted living for 4 years. His mind is..." She stopped. "The surgery was successful. He lived. He's not..." She stopped again. "He doesn't always know who I am anymore. But he's alive." He pushed back from the island, turned away, walked to the window above the sink and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the gray pre-dawn, and she looked at the line of his shoulders and thought about 11 years of carrying something alone and what it did to the body, the specific fatigue of it, and recognized it in him because she'd felt it in herself long enough to know its shape. "My grandmother," he said. "She's been dead for 3 years." "I know." He turned. "You knew." "I track news about the Vale family. Not actively, but I know the major events." "And you didn't come back." "The contract doesn't expire with her death. It's still binding, and..." She stopped. "And?" She looked at him. Let herself look at him the way she hadn't permitted since the moment she'd opened her front door and performed a stranger meeting a stranger. "And I didn't know if you'd want me to." The kitchen was very still for a long moment. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face. A hardening, the reassembly of the outer layer. "Garrett," he said. He answered. Listened for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. The color of his silence changed 3 times. "Send it to the secure folder. Don't move on anything until I call you." He ended the call. He set the phone on the counter. He did not pick it up again for a moment. "The document," he said. "The contract." Garrett found an annotation in the filing record, a secondary notation on the execution copy. It indicates the contract was reviewed and countersigned by a co-authorizing party. He picked up the phone, turned it to face her. On the screen was a scan of the contract's final page. Her own signature, 11 years old, in a hand that looked slightly different from her current one. Younger, she recognized it. the slight leftward lean she'd corrected over time. Below it, her father's medical authorization. Below that, the Vale family signature. And below that, a second co-authorization she had never seen before. A witness signature, notarized separately, with a firm stamp she didn't recognize. The name on the signature line was Celeste Voss. The floor did not shift. The walls did not move. Nora stood in the kitchen with her hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold and looked at a name on a phone screen and felt something happen in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite shock, because both of those things implied surprise, and she was past the range of what could surprise her, she thought. She had thought. She was 23, Lucian said. His voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go before, somewhere stripped of everything performative. My grandmother was already managing the Vale estate by then, but Celeste, he stopped. Celeste was already there, already inside the structure. I thought that was my grandmother's doing, her choice of personnel. It wasn't. No. He set the phone down. Celeste positioned herself. This document means she knew about you before I brought you into the family circle. Before my grandmother moved against you, she had prior access to the planning. He said the next words carefully. Which means the approach to my grandmother may have been initiated by Celeste, not the other way around. Nora put her mug down. Her hands were steady. She was focusing on keeping them steady because steadiness was the only thing she had to offer this moment. And she was going to offer it, or she was going to break something, and she had not allowed herself to break anything in 11 years. She engineered it, Nora said. She found out about us, found your grandmother, and used her fear of me choosing someone outside the family's approved circle. His jaw was tight. My grandmother had specific ideas about what the Vale heir's life was supposed to look like. Celeste would have known exactly which arguments to make. She was 23, Nora said. That's not impulsive, that's not jealousy, that's strategy. Yes. She's been managing you for 11 years. Yes. And the internal challenges you mentioned, the power struggle that brought you up here. She looked at his face. That's her too. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She could see it in the stillness, not confirmation, but the absence of denial, which at this level of conversation meant the same thing. She knows your investigation found the contract, Nora said. That's why the call came last night. She's not trying to flip me because she thinks I have operational intelligence about your syndicate. She's trying to flip me because she knows what I know, which is that she countersigned that document, which puts her inside your grandmother's play 11 years ago, which means she's been lying about the nature of her relationship to your family for over a decade. If that comes out, he said, the arranged engagement collapses, she said. Yes. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention that had always undone her, the kind that didn't categorize, didn't file, just received. She'd never met anyone else who looked at her the way he did. She'd told herself for years that was something she'd invented in memory, a romantic distortion of a past she'd needed to make bearable. Standing in his kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, she acknowledged to herself with a certain grim precision that she had not invented it. I need you somewhere safe, he said. I'm not going somewhere. Nora, I've been going somewhere for 11 years. She said it without heat. I'm not doing it again. He held her gaze. She held his. The distance between them was the width of a kitchen island and 11 years of accumulated consequence, and neither of them moved across it because this was not the moment for that. This was the moment for clear thinking and the kind of focus that required the suspension of everything else. Then you stay here, he said, in this house, my people, my security, until I understand the full scope of what Celeste has built. She thought about it. She thought about the unknown number and the 72 hours and the countersigned contract, and she thought about the specific surgical quality of Celeste Voss's smile in the grocery store, the practiced warmth of a woman who had been playing a very long game and was not afraid of being seen. All right, she said. He nodded. He picked up his phone. He stopped before he made the call. Your name, he said. Your real name. She looked at him. Nora, she said. That part was always real. Something moved in his face. He turned away to make the call. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway because it gave her hand something to do, and stared out the small window above the secondary kitchen sink at a sky that was just beginning to differentiate itself from the darkness, the first gray-blue seam of morning splitting the horizon over the water. What neither of them knew, in that kitchen, in that first thin light, was that Garrett had been on the phone with 2 people in the last 6 hours. Lucienne was one of them. Garrett's second call had gone to a relay number. The relay number connected to a woman in a hotel room in the city who had been awake since midnight and who received the information, contract found, veil aware, subject is in the estate, and who relayed it through 2 more steps to an untraceable device. The device was in Celeste Voss's possession. By 6:15 that morning, Celeste knew that Lucien had the contract. She knew that Nora was inside the estate. She knew the investigation had reached the countersignature. She sat in her hotel room with this information for approximately 4 minutes. Then she made 2 calls. The first call was to a man she used for situations requiring a specific skill set. The second call was to a lawyer whose retainer she had maintained for 7 years, a man whose value lay entirely in his knowledge of how to move assets across jurisdictions before anyone could establish injunctive relief. She was already building the exit before the evidence fully surfaced, and the exit required that certain loose ends be resolved. Nora Ashcroft, or Callahan, or whatever name she'd had at birth, was the loosest of those ends, not because of what she knew, because of what she represented to Lucien Vale, which Celeste had identified, cataloged, and feared for over a decade. The woman was the one argument Celeste had no counter for, had never had a counter for. The entire architecture of the last 11 years had been built around that single structural weakness. At 8 in the morning, Lucien's 2 gatemen reported a vehicle on the access road, parked, not moving. Different plates from the cars earlier in the week. At 8:14, Lucien appeared in the doorway of the room Nora was working in. She had borrowed a laptop charger and was finishing the client contract she'd been unable to focus on for days, and said, "We have a problem." His face told her the problem's scale before his words did. "Someone cut the external camera feed," he said. "Not from outside, but the access point is inside the network, and Garrett isn't answering his phone." She put the laptop down. "The 72 hours," she said. "We're at 14. She stood. "They accelerated. Someone inside my operation told them the contract had surfaced. They needed to move before I could use it." He was already moving, pulling his phone, opening a different line. "I need you to stay in this room. Don't open the exterior doors. Don't go near the windows." "Lucien, please." Again. That word again with the same unguarded weight. This time, it's not a request because of what I want. It's a request because what I need right now is to focus, and I cannot focus if I don't know exactly where you are. She sat back down. He made the call from the doorway. She could hear the controlled urgency in his voice. 5 words, a name, a location, a number. And then he was moving down the hall, and she heard the quality of the house shift around her, the quiet men no longer quiet, a new frequency of purposeful movement through rooms. She sat with the borrowed laptop charger in her hands and thought about Garrett, about the second call, about the specific detail that the camera network had been cut from inside, and what that meant about the boundaries of who Lucien could trust. She thought about the signature on the contract, 23 years old, long game. She thought about her father in his assisted living facility 200 miles south, in a room with his name on the door and a window facing a garden he sometimes recognized and sometimes didn't, and how the facility had called her 6 weeks ago about updated emergency contact forms, and how she had given them her name and her number and the name of a secondary contact, a colleague, a professional acquaintance, but not the name of anyone who could reach her if reaching her became the object of a deliberate search. They had her name. Nora Ashcroft. Her phone number. The facility had both. And whoever was inside Lucien's operation, whoever had fed information to Celeste Voss at 6 in the morning, had access to Garrett's files. Garrett's files included her employment records, her lease history, the apartment references, and the slow reconstructed thread of her movements over 6 years. If they'd kept pulling that thread, they would have found the assisted living facility. If they'd found the facility, they had her father's location. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. She had the door to the room open before she'd decided to open it. She was in the hallway moving toward the sound of Lucien's voice when the house phone on the hall table rang, an old landline, fixed, the kind of number almost no one had, and she stopped because landlines in private estates didn't ring by accident, and the specific quality of this ring in this moment was the sound of something arriving that could not be unarrived. She picked it up. "Ms. Ashcroft." The voice was professionally neutral. Male, not the same voice as the unknown number from the night before. That a different voice, a different operator, the same organization. "We want you to know that we're aware your father is currently a resident of Harrow Hill Care Center. We also want you to know that his current situation, his safety, his continued comfortable residency, is something we consider an open variable." She gripped the receiver. "Open variable," she said, "meaning it could be closed in several ways." A pause. "We'd like you to walk out of the Vale estate in the next 10 minutes, unaccompanied. Take the access road down to the main junction. A car will meet you there. If you do this, your father remains comfortable and undisturbed. If you choose to remain in the estate and allow Mr. Vale's investigation to proceed. If you touch him," she said very quietly, "I will make it my life's work to dismantle every structure that protects you. That's not a threat. That's information." 10 minutes, Miss Ashcroft." The line went dead. She stood in the hallway with the receiver in her hand and felt the specific sensation of a trap closing that she had not seen being built, which was the worst kind. The kind that felt like gravity. Inevitable, structural, operating on laws that predated her awareness of them. She put the receiver down. Lucien appeared at the end of the hall. He looked at her face. He crossed the distance between them in 6 steps and took the receiver from her hand. She hadn't realized she was still holding it, and looked at it, then at her. "Who called?" She told him. All of it. Her voice was flat and fast and entirely precise because there was no time for anything else, and she was not going to perform composure when composure was a performance. She was going to report the facts and let him work with them because that was what this moment required. When she finished, his face had gone somewhere past anger, past the cold resolution she'd seen in the study last night. Somewhere she didn't have a word for because it was a combination of things. Fury and guilt, and something that looked terrifyingly like the face of a man who had been containing something for a long time and was about to stop. "They have my father's location," she said. "Whoever is inside your operation gave it to them." "Nora, I am not walking out of this house," she said, "and I am not leaving my father unprotected. Those two things are both true at the same time. Figure out how to make them both work." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he turned and began making calls in rapid succession, his voice stripped of everything except the essential components of instruction. And she stood in the hallway of his estate and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the life she had built, the careful, constructed, forward-moving life that she had assembled out of the wreckage of one night 11 years ago, was gone. Not because of him, not because of the contract or the investigation or the name on a phone screen, because Celeste Voss had decided that the only way to secure what she'd spent 11 years building was to make Nora Callahan disappear for good this time. And this time the mechanism was not a legal agreement and a hospital bill. And the woman standing in the hallway, who had once signed a contract and walked away, was not the same woman who had her hands at her sides right now, breathing slowly, watching Lucien Vale work through his phone's contact list with the controlled fury of someone who had just understood the full scope of what he was fighting. That woman was gone too. What was left was something leaner and considerably less willing to accommodate anyone's agenda except her own. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do." He looked up from the phone. Something in his face shifted. Recognition, maybe, or the relief of a man who had stopped having to manage alone. "Stay on me," he said. "Don't make decisions without telling me first. And whatever you're thinking about your father right now, I need you to trust that I can move faster than they can if you give me 30 minutes. "You have 20, she said. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way. 20. He moved. She moved with him. The next 20 minutes had the quality of controlled combustion. Everything burning but contained, directed. The heat serving a purpose rather than consuming at random. Lucien worked through 4 calls in parallel, handing instructions to the quiet men who were no longer quiet, repositioning assets she couldn't see and didn't need to see the details of. She stayed close and watched his face and learned things about him in those 20 minutes that 11 years of absence had not taught her. The way he processed under pressure, which was not loudly, not with visible urgency, but with a specific compression, like a man who had been through worse and had his own internal system for converting fear into function. On the 3rd call, he said a name, Harrow Hill, the facility, her father's facility, and gave instructions she could only half follow, involving a private security firm and a relocation protocol, and language that meant her father would be moved within the hour to a location nobody associated with her could access in less than a day. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. On the 4th call, he said Garrett's name. The call went to voicemail. He looked at the phone for 1 second and then moved on, and she understood from the way he moved on that the Garrett question had been answered, just not in any way he was going to process right now. At 8:47, one of the gate men, the older one, the one with the gray at his temples, and the habit of standing slightly sideways to any doorway, appeared at the end of the hall and said, "Vehicle on the road. 2 more behind it. They're not parking." Lucien said, "How long?" "To the gate? 4 minutes, maybe 3. "Where's Marcus?" "East wing." "Tell him the east approach, not the road. They'll send someone over the property line while the vehicles take the gate." He was already moving toward the study. "To Nora. With me." She went with him. The study was not where she expected. He bypassed it, went past it, through a door at the end of the corridor that she hadn't noticed because it was paneled to match the wall, and beyond it was a shorter hallway, and then a room that was not decorated, not furnished for guests, not anything except functional. Metal shelving, a steel cabinet, a second door to the outside, heavy, the kind of door that locked from inside with a bar rather than a key. He opened the steel cabinet. She looked at the contents and felt the situation's weight land fully. Not surprised she'd been moving through surprise for the last 3 hours, but the specific gravity of a moment that had finished becoming theoretical and was now entirely real. "Have you used one before?" he said. "I know how they work." He looked at her. "My father," she said. "He was careful about certain things. He taught me before." She stopped. "Before." He handed her a compact 9mm. "Safety's there. Rounds chambered." She took it. The weight was familiar in the unpleasant way of things you've trained for and hoped you'd never apply. He took a different weapon for himself and checked it with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the action was as ordinary as straightening a collar. "The east property line," she said. "You said they'd come over it. It's where I'd come from if I were them." "There's a drainage culvert," she said, 20 meters north of where the stone wall ends, ground cover right up to it. If someone knows the property..." He looked at her. "You've been scoping the property line." "I've been living next to an empty estate for 14 months. She checked the safety. "I notice things." "Show me on the map." He pulled out his phone, opened a satellite image. She put her finger on the culvert. He studied it for 2 seconds. Made a call. 2 words, a compass direction, a number. Ended it. From the front of the house, she heard the sound of the gate. Metal on gravel. A voice. The acoustic signature of a confrontation beginning. "Stay behind me," he said. "I'm not going to shoot you by accident," she said. "That's not why." He met her eyes. For 1 second, just one, the tactical person and whatever was underneath it occupied the same face at the same time. "Stay behind me." They moved. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated violence she had ever been adjacent to, and she had spent 11 years working in corporate environments where the violence was financial and therefore invisible, which she now understood had been a profound luxury. The assault came from 3 directions simultaneously: the gate, the east property line, and the cliffside approach that Lucien had not predicted, and which cost them the first 30 seconds of the engagement before Marcus, appearing from somewhere she couldn't track, neutralized the cliff approach with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested this was not the first time he had done exactly this. She and Lucien were in the secondary garden, a walled space off the east wing, Stone bench, dead winter plantings, high walls on 3 sides, and the back wing of the estate on the 4th, when the east line was breached. 2 men over the wall, fast and practiced. The first one came over and Lucien was already moving, already inside the man's reach before the man had his footing. And what happened next was brief and brutal, and she did not look away because looking away was a form of dishonesty about where she was and what was happening. And she was done with dishonesty. The second man cleared the wall and saw her, adjusted his trajectory. She had the 9mm up before he'd completed the adjustment. She didn't shoot. She didn't need to because the sightline was enough. The specific stillness of a person who has a round chambered and is not afraid to use it has its own communication. And the man stopped moving, and then Marcus was there, and the situation resolved. She lowered the weapon. Her hands were entirely steady. She would examine that later. Not now. You all right? Lucien close, checking her face rather than her body. Yes. She looked at the east wall. How many more? We're about to find out. The answer they found out over the next 20 minutes as Lucien's people swept the property and the surrounding access road was 7 total. 3 in the vehicles at the gate, 2 over the east wall, 1 at the cliff approach, 1 who had come through the culvert she'd identified and been waiting there for a signal that never came because the signal chain had been disrupted when the gate confrontation went wrong for the attacking side. None of Lucien's people were killed. 2 were hurt, neither critically. On the other side, 4 were detained and 3 had retreated back down the road in the surviving vehicle, which meant they had a tail number and a direction, and Lucien's people were already on it. She stood in the secondary garden in the pale October morning with the 9mm at her side and watched the estate reassemble itself around her and felt for the first time in 11 years like she was standing on the correct side of something. The detained men said nothing useful in the first 10 minutes. The fourth one, the culvert, was a different quality of professional from the others. Younger, tighter, the kind of training that was more recent and more expensive. He looked at Lucien across the estate's utility room where 4 men with very specific postures were making the space feel very small, and he looked at him with the expression of someone running calculations. You know who sent you, Lucien said. The man said nothing. I know who sent you, Lucien said. What I need is the chain. Who received the order? How many steps from her to you? Nothing. Lucien crouched in front of the chair, level with the man's face, his elbows on his knees. He spoke quietly. You have a professional code, and I respect it. I'm not going to waste your time or mine with the kind of persuasion that takes hours and produces unreliable information. A pause. But here's the thing about the person who sent you here this morning. She tried to get the woman next door to flip on me last night. She called on an anonymized line. She gave a 72-hour window and then accelerated to 14 because my investigation found something she couldn't let me develop. He let that settle. She burned your timeline for her own protection. She burned you. If you're calculating whether the loyalty is worth the cost of maintaining it, that calculation should factor in the fact that she's already prioritizing her exit over your success. The man looked at him. Something moved in his jaw. 3 steps, the man said. Field coordinator, logistics liaison, then your name. Who's the field coordinator? A name. Lucien's face didn't change. He stood, moved to the door. Make him comfortable, he said to the room, in a tone that in any other context might have meant something different, and in this one meant exactly what it said. He and Nora stood in the hallway outside. The field coordinator, she said. You know him. He's been on my security committee for 2 years, why... His voice was entirely flat. He's been in the room for every operational discussion I've had about this relocation. He fed the timeline to Celeste. He fed everything to Celeste. He looked at the wall. She's been reading my operations for 2 years through him. Every decision I made about the internal restructuring, the power struggle, the personnel changes, she's been 3 steps ahead of me because she had someone reading the same table I was sitting at. Nora thought about that. The internal challenges you mentioned when you arrived, the reason you came up here, were manufactured. He said it without inflection. Engineered to isolate me, drive me out of the city, reduce my operational visibility. Cut me off from my broader network while she consolidated the relationships I wasn't there to manage. He pressed two fingers to his jaw, the scar line, a gesture she didn't think he knew he made. And I walked into it, because she was positioned inside my structure and I trusted the structure. You couldn't have seen it. I should have. Simple. No self-pity in it, just the accounting of a man who held himself to a standard. Lucienne. She waited until he looked at her. You found the contract. You found the countersignature. You pulled the thread before she could cut it. You didn't walk into anything. She's just been in the room longer than you realized. She held his gaze. Now you know she's there. That changes what the room looks like. He looked at her for a moment. I need to get to the city, he said. To Celeste. To the financial structures first. She's already moving assets. My lawyer is working on the injunctive block, but Celeste has her own counsel and they have a head start. He was already moving toward the study. She'll know the assault failed. She's escalating to financial dismantlement. She can't beat me directly anymore, but she can hollow out the structure from underneath. And then Celeste herself. Yes. He stopped, turned. I can't bring you into the city with me, not with the field coordinator still. You're not bringing me, she said. I'm going. Nora, my father is being relocated right now because of this woman. She said it evenly. She used him as a variable. She used me as leverage. She's been managing my life from a distance for 11 years, and I have been accommodating that management because I didn't know I was doing it. She stood in the hallway of his estate in yesterday's clothes with a 9mm she'd borrowed and her hands at her sides and felt the things she'd noticed earlier, the leaner, less accommodating version of herself, settle into something final. I'm going. That's not negotiable. He looked at her face. All right, he said. They left in one vehicle, Lucien, Nora, Marcus, and one other man whose name she wasn't given. The drive was 3 hours of gray autumn highway, and the particular tension of a car containing people who have just been through something and are preparing for something worse. Lucien was on the phone for the first 90 minutes. She watched the landscape and listened to the one-sided architecture of his calls, and built a picture of what was happening in the city ahead of them. Lawyers, account freezes, loyalty tests being run on personnel, the rapid realignment of a power structure in the aftermath of a discovered infiltration. At the 90-minute mark, he ended the last call, put the phone in his jacket, looked out the window. The coordinator's name is Fenwick, he said, not to anyone specifically. I promoted him 18 months ago, gave him the security committee seat because he'd been reliable for 4 years before that. A pause. She turned him before I promoted him, before the seat. She was building the access point before I gave her one. How long has she been planning this? Nora said. At least 4 years, probably longer. He turned to look at her. Since before my grandmother died. The contract countersignature means she was already positioned 11 years ago, so the planning horizon, he stopped. The planning horizon is longer than the operation I'm running to dismantle it. You'll dismantle it anyway. Yes. No uncertainty in it. Not bravado, just the assessment of a man who knew his own capacities. They hit the city limits at noon. The sky had closed in, cloud cover flat and gray, the kind of November light that made everything look slightly undersaturated. The financial district rose ahead of them in glass and concrete. And somewhere in it, Nora knew, Celeste Voss was in a room with lawyers and a phone and a calculation running about how much time she had left. Lucien's lawyer met them at a private office 3 blocks from the Vale Syndicate's registered address. A small man with the specific exhausted precision of someone who'd been working since 4 in the morning and would continue until there was nothing left to us. He spread documents across a table and walked them through the situation in language that was technical and fast. And Nora followed it because she was a consultant, and financial architecture was her professional vocabulary, and she contributed twice, once to flag a structure she recognized from her own corporate work as a common asset concealment mechanism, once to identify an anomaly in a transfer timeline that the lawyer hadn't caught. Lucien looked at her both times, said nothing. The lawyer said, "We have injunctive relief on 4 of the 6 accounts. The other 2, he stopped. She was faster than we were on those two. Approximately 40 million moved through a Cayman structure in the last 6 hours. How much of that is recoverable? Weeks, maybe months through international cooperation. It's not gone, but it's not fast. Lucien nodded. What does she still have that's inside our reach? The Voss family's co-investment position in the Vale development portfolio. Approximately 80 million in illiquid assets she cannot move without your signature or a court order. That's the piece she needs. That's why she hasn't fully fled. She's waiting for leverage enough to force the signature. Or to remove the person the signature belongs to, Nora said. The room was quiet. Yes, the lawyer said. Lucien stood. Where is she right now? The lawyer hesitated. Where? Lucien said. Sable Building, 43rd floor. She has a suite. She's been using it as a base for 3 days. Her counsel is with her, 2 of them, and she has private security, 4 minimum in the building. He was already moving toward the door. Lucien. She was on her feet. He looked at her. Not like this, she said. Not walking into a building with private security and 2 lawyers with whatever you're planning to walk in with. She crossed to him. She's waiting for you to come at her directly. That's the move she's prepared for. You walk through that lobby and she has a response ready. He stopped. She could see the momentum in him. 11 years of it, compressing the last 72 hours of it, everything that had been done in the name of a conspiracy she'd run for over a decade. And she understood it because she felt her own version of it, smaller maybe, differently shaped, but the same essential substance. Then what? He said. You send me, she said. Marcus, by the window, turned his head. The lawyer looked up from the documents. Lucien's face went entirely still. No. She doesn't see me coming, Nora said. She saw you coming in that grocery store 24 hours ago. She has a response for you. She has lawyers, she has security, she has 11 years of knowing how you operate. She held his gaze. She does not have a response for me walking in there alone because she has never had to have one. She tried to buy me off. When that failed, she tried to have me removed. She hasn't had to account for the possibility that I might choose the fight. You're not trained for... I'm not walking in there to hit anyone, she said. I'm walking in there because she needs something from you, and I know how to make her tell me exactly what she's willing to do to get it. She paused. I spent 11 years being managed by someone I didn't know was managing me. I know exactly how this woman thinks. I've been living inside the consequences of her thinking since I was 23 years old. Her voice was level and entirely certain. Send me in. Give me 20 minutes. The room held its breath. If she's in there with lawyers, Nora said, she's trying to build a legal path to something. I can find out what path before she's ready to use it. And I can do it in 20 minutes because she is going to be so focused on what she expected to be walking through that door that she will not see what actually walked through it until it's too late. Lucien looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. Marcus goes with you, he said. Lobby only. You have 20 minutes and then I'm coming in regardless. Agreed. Nora. His voice dropped below the room. If she moves on you, I'll be the one who moves first, she said. She picked up her bag. She checked the 9mm, put it in the inside pocket of the blazer she'd been wearing for 36 hours, and walked to the door. The Sable Building's lobby was marble and silence, and the refrigerated air of serious money. Marcus sat in a chair near the elevator bank with a newspaper he wasn't reading. She rode up to the 43rd floor alone, watching the numbers change, breathing at a pace she controlled by counting it. Not because she was afraid, but because her body had its own opinion about what was happening, and she needed it to wait. The elevator doors opened. A reception area, neutral and expensive. 2 men near the suite's main door who were not secretaries. She gave them her name. Not Ashcroft. Callahan. Her real name. The name that was on the contract. She watched both men's expressions process it. She watched one of them pick up a phone. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing for 11 years. The door to the suite opened. Celeste Voss stood in the doorway in a dark suit, hair perfect, the full armor of a woman who had been expecting either good news or battle and had prepared for both. She looked at Nora. She looked at her with the specific expression of someone encountering a variable they had assessed as neutralized, and Nora held that look, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction because this was not over and satisfaction was for after. "Ms. Callahan," Celeste said, very smooth, very controlled. The smile from the grocery store deployed again. "We need to talk," Nora said. "Alone." A pause. The two men near the door. "Of course," Celeste said, and she stepped back to let her in, and her eyes moved once, fast, involuntary, to the stairwell door at the end of the reception area, a glance that lasted less than a second before she recovered. Nora saw it. She walked into the suite and heard the door close behind her and thought, she has someone in the stairwell. She's not planning a conversation. And she had 20 minutes and a 9mm and 11 years of being someone else. And she was done being someone else. And whatever Celeste Voss had waiting in that stairwell was about to discover that the woman who had signed a contract and walked away was not the woman who had just walked through that door. Nora stopped in the center of the suite, turned to face Celeste, put her hand inside the blazer and drew the 9mm and set it on the coffee table between them with a sound that was not loud but was entirely sufficient. Celeste's smile didn't disappear. It recalibrated. "Call whoever's in the stairwell," Nora said. "Tell them to stand down. You have 10 seconds before I call Lucian and he comes through the lobby." A silence. Then Celeste reached for her phone, said 2 words into it, put it down. "You've changed," Celeste said. "You don't know what I was," Nora said. "Sit down." Celeste sat. The lawyers were visible through the inner office glass, watching. Nora didn't look at them. She looked at Celeste and let 11 years of accumulated consequence fill the space between them without apology. "The co-investment position," Nora said. $80 million in illiquid assets. You need a signature. He won't give it, so here's what you're going to do instead." She kept her voice even. "You're going to sign a full disclosure, so every communication with Fenwick, every instruction related to the assault this morning, every step of the contract 11 years ago, signed, witnessed, filed. And in exchange, Lucien doesn't pursue criminal referrals on the asset transfers. You walk away with whatever you moved offshore and nothing else." Celeste looked at her. The calculation was visible, just barely, behind the composed surface. "You can't offer that. That's his decision." Nora picked up her phone, dialed. He answered on the first ring. "She wants confirmation," Nora said. Lucian's voice came through, flat and final. "The offer stands. Sign the disclosure or I walk into that building in 8 minutes and we do this differently." She held the phone toward Celeste for 1 second, then put it to her ear. 8 minutes, she said. "Don't be early." She ended the call. Celeste sat very still. The smile was gone now. What was underneath it was older and harder and considerably less polished. The face of someone who had built an empire on other people's silence and was watching the last wall come down. "Fine," Celeste said. She said it quietly, without drama, in the voice of a woman doing math and accepting the outcome. She picked up her phone and called her lawyer into the room. The disclosure took 6 minutes to draft in acceptable form. Nora stood at the window and watched the street below while it was prepared, her hand steady at her side, and thought about a hospital waiting room and a contract and a man who hadn't known and a woman who'd counted on him never finding out. Celeste signed. Nora photographed every page on her phone, sent them to Lucien's number, and watched the delivery confirmation appear. "We're done," she said. She picked up the 9mm from the coffee table. She walked to the suite door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at Celeste Voss one final time. The dark suit, the careful hair, the ruins of 11 years of architecture visible only to someone who knew what they were looking at. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left that needed saying. She walked out and took the elevator down and stepped into the marble lobby where Marcus was already on his feet, reading her face, and she said, "It's done," and meant it in every sense the words could carry. Outside, Lucian's car was already at the curb. He was out of the car before it fully stopped. She saw him cross the sidewalk toward her, and she saw in his face the specific expression of a man who had been monitoring a phone and a clock for 20 minutes and was now conducting a rapid inventory of whether she was intact. And something about the thoroughness of that inventory, the way his eyes moved over her before he said anything, checking, accounting, made her throat tighten in a way she did not have time for right now, and filed away for later. Disclosure, he said, photographed and sent. Your phone. He'd already checked it. He was checking it again while she spoke, scrolling through the pages, his jaw set. Marcus had come out behind her and was speaking low to the second man, operational debrief, the kind of exchange that happened automatically among people who worked together in situations like this and didn't need ceremony. Fenwick, she said, in custody. My people reached him 40 minutes ago at his apartment. He didn't fight it. Lucian put his phone away. He knew it was coming. He looked tired. When they told me what he looked like, that was the word they used. Did he say why? Lucian looked at her. She offered him a way out of something old from before he came to work for me. She had documentation. Pause. She collected people's vulnerabilities, filed them, used them when she needed to. Nora thought about a 23-year-old woman at a notary's desk, countersigning a contract designed to remove the one variable she couldn't control through other means. She thought about what that kind of patience implied, the long accumulation, the careful filing, the willingness to wait years for the right moment to apply the right pressure. She's been doing this her whole adult life, Nora said. Yes. And nobody saw it. Nobody wanted to. He said it simply. She was useful. She was connected. She made things easier in ways that were easy to be grateful for and difficult to interrogate. His voice didn't carry bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a man examining a failure of attention. That's how it works. You let the useful thing keep being useful, and you don't look at the mechanism. But she wasn't. The city moved around them. Taxis, pedestrians, the ordinary Tuesday velocity of a place that didn't know and wouldn't care. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Sable building in yesterday's clothes and 36 hours of accumulated consequence, and felt the adrenaline that had been carrying her since the estate began its slow recession, the way a tide goes out, leaving everything exposed. My father, she said, relocated as of 9/17 this morning. Harrow Hill is cooperating fully. I had my lawyer contact the facility director directly. He's in a private suite at a secure residential facility 2 counties over. The staff know not to release his location to anyone except you. He paused. He's comfortable. He doesn't know anything happened. She looked at the pavement for a moment, took one breath, let it out. Thank you, she said. The words were inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were what she had. Don't, he said quietly. Not unkindly. Don't thank me for that. She looked up. I spent 11 years not knowing, he said. Not knowing you existed, not knowing what she'd done, not knowing what my grandmother had been capable of when she decided to protect the family she imagined instead of the family she had. Something moved in his face that he didn't suppress. Your father paid for my ignorance. You paid for it. Don't thank me for addressing a debt I didn't know I owed but owe regardless. She didn't say anything for a moment. The city kept moving. Somewhere above them, on the 43rd floor, Celeste Voss was doing the math on what she had left and what she'd lost. And that math would be accurate and terrible, and Nora found that she felt almost nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not relief. The absence of something that had been pressing on her for 11 years, and the absence of a pressure is not the same as comfort. It's just space. New space. She didn't know yet what she was going to put in it. We should get off this sidewalk, Marcus said from somewhere behind her. Professionally, not urgently. They got back in the car. The next 72 hours were the infrastructure of aftermath, the kind of work that doesn't look like work from the outside but is the heaviest kind. The depositions, the documentation, the calls with lawyers on multiple sides of multiple issues, the careful reconstruction of what Celeste Voss had built and how it had been built and who had known which part of it. Nora stayed in the city for all of it. She moved out of the company's guest apartment on the 14th floor. It was compromised in the sense that its address was in Garrett's files, and Garrett's files had gone to Celeste, which meant it was in the possession of a woman who was now cooperating with a disclosure process and could not be fully trusted regardless. And Lucien city residents had a secondary floor that he offered without making it anything other than a logistical solution, and she accepted it on the same terms. They were careful with each other in those 72 hours. She noticed it in both of them. A mutual caution, not the cold caution of the Cliff House, not the performed distance of two strangers, but something more delicate, The caution of people handling something they know can break and know is worth not breaking. They worked in parallel from the same space. She had her laptop and her company's remote access, and 3 days of backed-up professional obligations that she moved through with methodical efficiency, because work had always been the mechanism that kept her functional, and she was not going to abandon the mechanism just because the context had changed. He had calls, meetings, a continuous restructuring of a professional world that had been infiltrated at its foundation, the patient and exhausting work of rebuilding trust from verified ground up. They ate dinner at the same table on the second night. She made it, not because she was performing domesticity, but because the kitchen was there and she needed something physical to do with her hands, and she had always cooked when she was processing. It was a habit from before that had survived everything. She made pasta with what was in the pantry. He sat at the kitchen counter and watched her and didn't pretend he wasn't watching. "Garrett," she said. She hadn't asked yet. She'd been not asking for 2 days. A pause. "He wasn't flipped," Lucian said. "He wasn't working for Celeste." She turned. "Then why didn't he answer your calls?" "He was running." Lucian's voice was even. He found the counter signature on the contract and he recognized the name. He knew Celeste. He'd done work for her family years before I hired him, work he'd told me about, but in general terms without specifics. When the signature surfaced, he understood that if I connected those two things, his prior work, the contract, the timing of his hire, the conclusion would look a particular way. A pause. He panicked. He went dark. He was trying to construct an explanation before I reached him. "Did you reach him?" "He called me yesterday morning, 6 a.m. Something moved in his jaw. He talked for 40 minutes, all of it consistent, all of it verifiable. He looked at the counter. He made a mistake. He should have come to me immediately. But he wasn't a plant. "How much did that matter to you?" she said. "Getting that answer." He looked up, met her eyes. "More than I expected," he said, which probably tells me something about the last 2 years I'd rather not examine too closely right now. She turned back to the stove. "We cannot examine it together," she said. "There's a lot of that to do." A silence. Then, from behind her, something that might have been the beginning of a real laugh. Short, quiet, the first one she'd heard from him. It didn't make it all the way either, but it made it further than the thing in the kitchen on the cliff had. On the third day, the legal situation stabilized enough that Lucien's primary counsel used the word contained for the first time, by which he meant that Celeste's ability to further damage the veil structure had been comprehensively blocked, that the asset recovery process was underway through proper international channels, and that the criminal referrals for the morning assault and the Fenwick situation were being processed by the appropriate authorities without complications. Celeste herself had retained a defense team and was cooperating with the disclosure to the precise degree required by the agreement and not 1 degree more, which was consistent with who she was and what they had expected. The engagement, the arranged engagement that had been the crown of her 11-year construction, was dissolved the same day. Lucian handled it through his counsel and did not discuss the details with Nora because it was not something that required her involvement, and he seemed to understand that without being told. She appreciated the understanding. On the 4th day, she drove back to the cliff. Not because she'd decided anything, because her things were there, the ordinary infrastructure of a life. Clothes, books, the second suitcase she'd started packing and not finished, the company equipment she'd left behind in the operational chaos of the last several days. Practical reasons. She told herself practical reasons. She drove up the access road in the thin afternoon light and pulled into the gravel drive and sat in the car for a moment looking at the small house she'd rented for 14 months. The east-facing terrace where she'd drunk morning coffee, the locked terrace door, the kitchen window that faced the property line. The estate next door was quiet. His vehicles were still there. He hadn't come back yet, was still in the city managing the restructuring, and the gate was closed and the place looked exactly as it had looked for the 14 months before his convoy arrived, except that she could not see it that way anymore. The before was gone. She had been telling herself for a week that the before was a construction anyway, that the cliff house had never been the peaceful, isolated outpost she'd needed it to be, that she'd been living adjacent to a ghost story for over a year without knowing it was haunted, that the ending of the before was not a loss. She got out of the car, went inside. The house smelled like herself, the specific neutral smell of a space that had absorbed someone's routines and become unconsciously domestic. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. The dish towel drawer was open slightly. She'd left it open when she'd taken the book out the second time. The book was on the bedside table where she'd put it. She stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at it. The worn spine, the cover facing away. She picked it up, sat on the edge of the bed, turned it over in her hands. It was a novel about a cartographer who spent 20 years mapping a coastline that kept changing, and the fundamental problem of trying to record something that refused to hold still. She had found it in a second-hand shop at 22 and read it 4 times before she was 23. She had been 23 when she'd left it behind in an apartment she'd had to vacate in 48 hours, and she had looked for another copy for years and never found one. He had kept it. She sat with that for a long time. The light moved. The sea made its argument below. She sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet house and held a book that had been on a shelf somewhere in Lucien Fail's possession for 11 years and thought about what that meant, and declined to make it mean more than it was, and also declined to make it mean less. She was still sitting there when she heard the car on the access road. She didn't move immediately. She heard the gate, then the engine, then footsteps on gravel, and she got up and went to the kitchen window out of old habit and watched him cross from the estate gate to her front door in the fading afternoon light, coat on, hands in his pockets, the walk of a man who has been in rooms with lawyers and accountants for 3 days and has come to the end of his patience with both. He knocked. She answered it. He looked at her face, at the book in her hand. He said nothing about the book. "I came to get my car," he said. "You have 3 cars. The other 2 are spoken for." Something in his eyes. Not amusement exactly. The forerunner of it. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in the kitchen of the small house that was not his and looked at it the way he'd looked at her since the first morning, with the attention that didn't categorize, just received. And she stood on the opposite side of the kitchen counter and waited. "The restructuring," she said, "will take months, maybe a year. I have people I trust, actually trust, verified trust, the kind that holds up to scrutiny. And I'm building from there." He looked at the dish towel drawer, still slightly open. "It's going to be a different organization when it's done. More transparent, more legitimate. The security and logistics operations are solid. The rest of it, the parts that required the kind of infrastructure Celeste was able to infiltrate." A pause. "Those parts are going away. By choice?" "By choice." He met her eyes. "I've been running something that required me to be unavailable to scrutiny. That was useful for a long time, and it was also exactly the vulnerability she needed. Those 2 things are connected." He said it the way he'd said things throughout the last week. Without self-pity, just the accounting. You can't build walls against a specific threat if the walls are also what the threat is using to operate. She thought about that. "What does it look like on the other side?" "Smaller," he said. "Cleaner. A company that does what it says it does and can prove it." He paused. "Less interesting to people like Celeste." "Less interesting to a lot of people." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I'm willing to be less interesting." The kitchen was quiet. The sea noise came in from below the cliff, steady and indifferent, the same noise it had been making since she arrived 14 months ago and would make long after she left. "The contract," she said, "the legal agreement. My lawyers have filed to have it voided, executed under duress with material deception about the initiating party. The countersignature alone is grounds. Celeste was not a party with legal authority to bind the Vale family, which means the contract's foundation is fraudulent." He paused. "It'll be formally annulled within the month. Probably sooner." She absorbed this. "It doesn't change what happened." "No," he said, "it doesn't. My father still spent 11 years with the daughter who was running." "Yes." "And you still spent 11 years. She stopped. "Looking for something I couldn't name," he said quietly, "and being angry at myself for looking, because I'd told myself you made a choice, and I had to respect it." He held her gaze. "I thought you left. I thought you decided we weren't worth—" He stopped, looked at the counter for a moment. "I was wrong about what happened, and I spent 11 years being wrong about it in ways that had consequences. That's not something the contract annulment addresses." "No," she said, "it's not." Silence. Your father, he said. When can he have visitors? She looked at him. The question had arrived without preamble, without the architecture of anything except genuine inquiry, and it was the question that undid her more than anything else that had happened in the last week, more than the contract or the countersignature or the 9mm on the coffee table or the 20 minutes in Celeste's suite, because it was so entirely specific and so entirely without agenda. He won't know who you are, she said. Her voice was level. He has good days and bad days. On the bad days, he doesn't always know who I am. I know. You'd be a stranger to him. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said, not hostile, genuinely asking. He thought about it. Because he was part of the cost, he said. And I can't give 11 years back. I can't give back the version of you that didn't have to run or the version of him that had his daughter present for all of it. But I can... He stopped. I can show up, going forward. That's the only direction available. She set the book on the kitchen counter between them, face up this time, cover visible. He looked at it. You kept it, she said. It was in the apartment when you left. I kept it because... He stopped. A long pause. I kept it because getting rid of it would have been a decision, and I wasn't ready to make that decision for a long time. And then enough time had passed that getting rid of it seemed like a different kind of decision, and I kept not making either one. That's very honest, she said. I'm trying to be. She picked the book up, held it for a moment. Then she set it down again on his side of the counter. He looked at it, looked at her. That's not... It's yours, she said. It was always yours. I just needed it to be somewhere safe for a while. He picked it up. He stood with it in both hands the way she'd been holding it earlier, turning it slightly. And she watched him do this and felt something in the architecture of the last 11 years shift in a way that was not collapse, not the catastrophic structural failure of the past week, but something slower, the way a building settles, the long adjustment of load-bearing elements finding a new equilibrium. They drove out to the cliff's edge at dusk. Not together. He walked, she walked. They ended up at the same place the way you end up at the same place when you've been moving toward the same point from slightly different angles. The path that ran north along the property line to where the ground ended, and there was just the guardrail, and then open air, and 200 feet of nothing before the rocks. The sea was gray and enormous in the failing light. The wind was cold, coming straight off the water, the kind of cold that didn't care about coats. She stood at the guardrail with both hands on the rusted metal and looked out at the horizon where the sky and the Atlantic met in a line that was perfectly flat and enormous in its indifference. He stood beside her, not touching, just beside. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. When I saw your convoy come up the road, the first day, when I saw you get out of the car, she paused. Let the wind take the pause. I knew in the first 30 seconds, and the first thing I felt wasn't fear. It wasn't the old grief. It wasn't even the calculation about the contract. She stopped again, made herself continue. It was relief. The smallest, stupidest, most inconvenient relief. Like something that had been braced had finally stopped bracing. She looked at the water. I hated that. I spent the next week hating that more than I hated any of the rest of it. He was quiet for a moment. I called the estate rental agency the morning of the second day, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the water. Before I came to your door. I called them to find out how long you'd been there. 14 months. A pause. I told myself I needed the security information, but I checked your length of stay first before anything operational. He paused. I don't know what I was calculating. Maybe just how long you'd been close without me knowing. She looked at the horizon. 14 months. Yes. And you were in the city. 3 hours south, yes. She thought about that, about the geography of it, the specific accidental proximity that had preceded the week's events. Both of them within the same stretch of coastline for over a year, going about the separate businesses of their separate lives, not knowing. The way that felt like something and also like nothing, because knowing and not knowing produced different lives, and the not knowing had been real. Celeste, she said, the co-investment position, 80 million in illiquid assets. Will be extracted through the court process. It'll take time. That's not what I'm asking. She turned to look at him. Was there ever a point where that mattered to you more than it should have? The engagement, the arrangement, before you knew what she'd done? He held her gaze. No, he said, straightforward. She was useful and connected, and I was building something that required those things, and the arrangement made structural sense. It was never, he stopped. It was never what I wanted. I knew that. I told myself wanting was a luxury I'd given up, and I was managing well enough without it. She turned back to the water. I'm going to visit him next week, she said. My father, the new facility. I want to see how he's settled in. I'll drive you, he said. She looked at him. Not if you don't want me to, he said, but the offer is there. She looked back at the water. The light was almost gone now. That particular moment of coastal dusk where the sea goes darker than the sky, the horizon line disappearing, everything becoming the same shade of going dark. She had stood at this guardrail dozens of times in the last 14 months, alone, watching this same light make this same exit, and it had always felt like sufficient company, the sea and the dark, and the sufficient company of her own constructed solitude. It felt different now. Not worse, not better in any simple way. Just different. The difference of a person standing beside you who knows your real name and has been carrying a piece of evidence of your shared history on a shelf somewhere for 11 years without quite being able to put it down. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her hand found what she'd put there before she left the city. She hadn't decided to bring it, exactly. It had been in the drawer of the room she'd been using, and she'd picked it up without deciding and put it in her pocket and not examined the decision. She held it out to him. He looked at it. A pendant on a thin chain. Silver, small, a disc with a compass rose pressed into the metal. Simple. The kind of thing a person could wear every day, without it being a statement about anything except that they wore it every day. His face went still in the way it went still when something arrived that he needed to receive carefully. I bought it 3 weeks before everything happened, she said. I was going to give it to you. I had this idea. She stopped. It doesn't matter what the idea was. I had it, and then I didn't give it to you, and then I left, and I've been carrying it since. She looked at the pendant in her extended hand. That's 11 years of carrying a gift I never gave, and I'm done carrying it. It belongs to the person it was always for. He took it from her palm, turned it over once. The compass rose caught the last of the light and released it. I had an idea too, he said. 11 years ago, the week before. He looked at the pendant. Different idea, same general direction. A pause. I never got to execute it. I know, she said. Not because she did know, but because she understood the shape of things that didn't get to happen. He put the pendant in his coat pocket. He would do something with it later. She didn't know what, and didn't need to know. That part was his. They stood at the guardrail for a while longer. The dark came the rest of the way in. The sea kept doing what the sea did, which was not care, and which was also, in its own way, a kind of comfort. The world's indifference had always been easier to stand next to than human expectation. The house, she said, eventually. I have 2 months left on the lease. I know. He paused. I'm here through the restructuring. Easier to manage certain things from the estate than from the city. 4, maybe 5 months. So we're still neighbors. We're still neighbors. She let out a breath. All right. She turned from the guardrail and started back up the path toward the houses. He fell into step beside her. Not close, not distant, the natural distance of two people walking the same direction on a narrow path, adjusting without discussion for the terrain. The gravel drive came into view. Her car. His gate. The 2 small lights she'd left on in the kitchen because she'd learned after the first winter that coming back to a dark house at the end of a day like this was unnecessary, and she was allowed to make things unnecessary when she had the choice. Dinner, she said, at the fork in the drive where their paths separated. Not a question, not an invitation with weight behind it, just a word. He looked at her. I have pasta, she said, and whatever's in that pantry that survived 4 days of nobody being